pattern routed all of our pieces and we've cleaned up the transition here, I want to mark out the mortise in my lower rails. So I have both of my lower rails here. Okay, well, I made a mistake the first time. Let's try this one more time. You can see I've got some marks here I crossed out. Anyways, to help me out here, I came in and marked the front and the rear of my parts on both sides. So I got the rear marked and the front marked here as well. So what I want to do is come in 6.5 inches from the outside here. So I'm going to take a square and take the ruler actually off the square entirely and align it up with the edge. And since I now have it lined up with the edge, I can find and make a tick mark at 6.5 inches. So that's from the rear. I'm going to come over here, and I'm also going to come in 6.5 inches from the rear. And actually while I'm here, I should make the next tick mark, which is 7.25 inches. So why don't we just come back here and do that too? Because our mortise is going to be 3/4 of an inch long. Now I can come in and mark the width of my mortise. Now this piece here is 1 inch wide right here. And our mortise is 1/4 inch. And if it's right in the center, then what I want to do, I know the center is 1/2 inch. So if I add 1/4 inch to that, not quarter, 1/8, I'm sorry, if I add 1/8 inch, that would be my bottom. And if I turn it around, that would also be my top. I'm at the hollow chisel mortiser now, and I have a 1/4 inch bit in. I've squared it up to the piece, and I also have 2 pieces of MDF below it. Now this mortise is a through mortise, so I have those pieces of MDF below it, so that as I go all the way through, I have something below it backing up that cut so that I don't blow out any pieces on the exiting side. And I've set my depth of cut, well, my location that is, of my chisel, and I'm just going to come down on one end, come back up, come over to the other side, go all the way through again, and then connect everything. Before we put the chair back together, so we can get the distance for our stretcher, I want to bring across the location of the mortise onto the top of the lower stretcher. It's time to fit the stretcher to the lower rails. So I milled up this piece. Once again, it's 1/2 inch thick, 1 inch wide, and more than the length of the distance between these two spots. How much more? I don't know. Mine looks like it's maybe sitting around 5 inches. Just enough that I can do some test cuts. Once I get the test cuts, I got some room to then come and finish this off. So in this view, what you're seeing is us looking down inside the chair. And I've taken this rail, well, not the rail, it's going to be the stretcher. I've placed it on top of the 2 lower rails. And with it placed on top of the 2 lower rails, it's now acting just as if it was a fence, let's say, that's been attached to the front of the rear legs. So with our bevel gauge, what we're going to do is get what will be the complementary angle to the tenon we need to cut. So it's real simple to do that. All we need to do is take our bevel gauge, line it up with the back of the stretcher, make sure we're here, and then I get the blade of the bevel gauge running across the length here of my lower rail, and I lock that angle in. Before I do anything to my bevel gauge and accidentally lose this angle, I'm going to take my bevel gauge up to my piece of plywood I've been using and just draw this angle out. I'm at the table saw now, and I set my miter gauge angle to the same angle that I pulled off of the chair for the stretcher. And what I want to do is cut just a little bit off, enough to establish that new angle on the bottom of this piece. And we want our tenon to come all the way through that and protrude out just a little bit. So I'm actually going to make it a little bit longer than 3/4 of an inch. Why don't we cut this at 1 inch long? So I'm going to come here with my square and mark in 1 inch on both sides. If I'm at a 1/2 inch and my tenon is 1/4 inch thick, then that means I have 1/8 inch on both sides. So what I'm going to do is just set my tenon, or set my square that is, for 1/8 inch. And now that I've marked out where my tenon should be, as well as the length of the tenon, I have brought over my tenoning jig. First I got the tenoning jig and I re-squared it up to the tabletop. And after I re-squared it up to the tabletop, I then took my bevel gauge and I set the angle for my piece, the fence in the back, to be the same angle as the bevel gauge. So yesterday I was working on cutting the stretcher for the chair and, well, screwed up the multiple times. Anyways, this is a piece that for me, I tend to mill up a second part because somehow, maybe I shouldn't mill up the second part, but I know that more often than not, I tend to make a mistake on this piece. So, got myself another part all milled up and marked out, just like we marked out in the video. And now I'm going to use this as my spacer because I still have my tenoning jig set up for a right tilt table saw. Mine's a left tilt, the saw stop is. So I need to be able to push the faceplate closer to the blade or bring the workpiece closer to the blade. So I choose to bring the workpiece closer to the blade because I keep this set up for a right tilt so that I can use my angle joinery on it. Get them both into the tenoning jig and clamp down. I also want to point out that I replaced the fence or the backing board for the tenoning jig with a new 1/2 inch piece of plywood, and the reason for that was I had made so many cuts on the last one it was no longer supporting the piece in front of it, and I wanted to prevent blowout because I'm using. So I have the saw set up to take a cut on the right hand side of my waistline. Instead of trying to dial this in perfectly, I'm going to come in wide on each side of my waistline and just dial the thickness in with a shoulder plane. It's time to cut the first cheek of the tenon, and my blade is just probably a little bit below my cut line, so I'm going to make a pass and come back and lift the blade up until I just reach my cut line. And that'll give me my first cheek and shoulder for my tenon. With my shoulder cut, what I want to do now is bring around the lines for the shoulder around all 4 sides. So what I did was I took a square and brought it up to my piece and brought around this first line. On the other side, I brought around or up the next line. Then after I brought those lines up, I was then able to take my bevel gauge and bring around the line to the very top. Okay, what we're going to do now is draw in a virtual shoulder for ourselves. The reason why we're doing this is to locate our mortise and tenon when we draw the final length of the distance of these two pieces. So I know that I want a little bit of a shoulder, so I draw in my line here, showing me the material I'm going to remove, and then knowing that that is roughly 3/4 of an inch long, I can come in and mark out 3/4 of an inch and come in and draw the location of our tenon. You see? And this is the waist here that we'll be getting rid of. With that location marked, and pull those lines down. And the other one's just on the edge there. What I've done here is take a straight edge. I have lined up the 2-inch marker on my ruler with the edge of the tenon the mortise there, and I've done so on the opposite end as well. And what you see here is where the ruler or straight edge is meeting the line for the opposing mortise location. So to me it looks like that it's reading roughly 19 and 15 or 14/16. So I'm going to say 19 and 14/16. And we have to subtract 2 inches for the 2 inches at the end. So 19 and 14/16 minus 2 is 17 and 14/16. So we're looking at our stretcher right now, and I wrote down my distance between my 2 points on the stretcher, and that's 17 and 14/16 for me. Yours may be different. What I want to do is measure that distance not from the bottom here, but instead where we located our tenon shoulder. So the distance is between this point and the opposing point on the other side. So in order to do that, the first thing I'm going to do is bring my square in and set it so that when I draw a line, the line I'm going to draw is right where the top of the shoulder is. Okay. With that line drawn all the way down the length, and find where 17 and 14/16 is along this line from that point. And right here is where 17 and 14/16 is. So now that I know the distance between those two spots, if I take my bevel gauge, I can now, I can now bring my bevel gauge down. Oops, wrong way. Okay. I can now bring my bevel gauge down and strike a line for where my shoulder is going to be. And that's this one here. So now that I know where that is, I need to measure the length of this cut here from the dado set. Now it should be just about 1 inch, which it is. Then I can take my ruler and mark out where 1 inch is. And with that tick mark, I can now take my bevel gauge and mark out where I need to cut my piece at the same angle. I'm over here at the bandsaw now, and I've set my miter gauge up to the same angle that we use to cut the ends of our piece and we set up our tenoning jig at. I have a piece of MDF and I'm just putting that in front of my piece here that I'm going to cut for the stretcher. That way I don't cut into my miter gauge here, which is the last thing I want to do, especially with all this aluminum and whatnot. It would not be a fun thing. So with this setup, I can cut through this piece and just a little bit into the MDF and stop. I now have the stretcher clamped up in my tenoning jig. Unfortunately, like you would cut a vertical tenon, I can't just flip this piece over and cut both shoulders on each set of the same setup. One, flip, cut. It doesn't work that way because we have this angle here. So what we're going to do is we have to cut the shoulder for the tenon on the opposite direction now. And we're just going to dial. Once we do that, we'll then flip the pieces over and we'll cut the same thickness on the other side. And we're going to have to measure that by hand. But as long as we come within a couple thousandths of an inch, it's not going to be a problem. So let's go cut this tenon. All right, now that we've established shoulders on two opposing sides, here as well as here, we need to cut the shoulders on the opposite opposing sides. Before we do that, I'm going to bring over a layout line so I know where to cut this shoulder. What we're going to do now is take a square and set it against the tenon shoulder and bring it down until we bottom out, giving us the width of the shoulder. Now that we have the width of the shoulder, I can come around and instead of using a marker this time, I want to get really close to it. So I'm going to grab a pen, a knife I mean, I'm going to knife this. I can come in with a pencil and highlight that knife mark. So with the knife mark highlighted, you can see where you need to set up your other dado blade, or set up your dado blade for when you're cutting it on the tenoning jig. I'm going to do that for the opposite side as well. I now have yet another spacer here. I have this 1/2-inch piece of plywood, the bad piece from yesterday, and my good piece here. And what I've done is I've now set up the blade so that when it enters into the new piece, I'm cutting right on the knife line or just on the edge of the knife line. With all this set up, now we can go complete our tenon. After completing the first pass, I now unclamp the stretcher, flip it around, and clamp it back into the tenoning jig. With the stretcher now clamped into the tenoning jig, I take my fourth and final pass with the dado set. Okay, we're over at the bench, and I have my bench hook up. And the next thing we need to do is before we cut the width of the tenon and at the angle, I want to bring this down to the correct thickness to fit into our mortises. Over at the chair, I measured that, and that was 0.268 inches. So I'm just going to, with my rabbiting block plane, bring these down to just about the correct thickness. I don't want to go below 0.268, 0.270, somewhere around there would be perfect. After a few minutes of hand planing on each side, I now have a nice tight fit for my tenon into my mortise. Earlier what we did was we drew a vertical line here that was one of the outer shoulders or edges of our tenon. So what I want to do is take that line and make a little tick mark. And with that tick mark, I can line up my square and my pencil together and redraw that line. And what I have right now is I'm just eyeballing down the end of my ruler here for the square and making sure it's parallel to the line I just drew and find where 3/4 of an inch is. And with a new tick mark made, my pencil is sitting in there, I can now draw the other end of my shoulder. Flip the piece over, and the piece flipped over, I know that where this line meets is supposed to be the other angle for my tenon as well, or where the tenon meets, more importantly, where it meets the lower rail in the mortise. So I'm just going to bring that down on a tick mark, and with that down, I can now draw the other line for my mortise, for my tenon, with my ruler once again set so that it is, the edge of it's following that line here. I can come in and make a tick mark for 3/4 of an inch and draw the shape of the tenon. So I'm back here at the bench and I set my stretcher into my vise. I've clamped it down and I use a square to eyeball what the vertical is from my lines to the square. Okay, so what I want to do here is I have my Dazuki, and with my Dazuki saw, I am going to bring it up to my line. And start my cut and just cut straight down. And I stopped just short of the shoulder here. Let me bring that in. Now that we have the rough shape of our tenon, what I'm going to do is bring my square in and knife the edge of the shoulder here. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. So now that I've established the shoulder on both sides, I'm going to come in with a chisel and work back to that. Just removing waste slowly. Okay, I took the chair apart and I first fit in the stretcher, not completely, but pretty close to it, into the left-hand side of the chair. So now what I'm going to do is just try to line everything up. There we go. All right, we have our chair clamped up and our stretchers in, and it looks great. We have great connection between our shoulders here. It's really nice and tight. It's not really going anywhere. We have the tenon protruding here a little bit over 1/4 of an inch or so, and that's perfect.